Did a Roman historian validate the Bible? For centuries, the story of Jesus Christ was found almost exclusively in the Bible. But what if one of ancient Rome's most respected historians, a man who had zero connection to Christianity, and in fact thought Christians were contemptible, wrote about a man named Christus and his execution? What if this account, buried in a history of Roman emperors, had details that sound incredibly familiar to anyone who's read the Gospels? We're about to look at an ancient text that some say is undeniable proof of biblical history. But is it? Let's find out. Hello and welcome. When searching for the historical Jesus, one of the biggest questions has always been, what proof is there outside of the Bible? Skeptics often argue that Jesus was a myth, a figure of faith with no real grounding in history. Believers, on the other hand, look for outside sources to back up the New Testament's claims. We're going to focus on one single, powerful passage from one of Rome's greatest historians. This guy had no Christian agenda. In fact, he was a member of the Roman elite who saw this new Christian movement as a dangerous and mischievous superstition. And yet, in his detailed history of the Roman Empire, he wrote about its founder, a man he called Christus, and his execution by a Roman governor named Pontius Pilate. So today, we're going to put on our detective hats and put this ancient text under the microscope. We'll look at who the author was, what his words actually say, what they confirm, and just as important, what they don't. Is this passage the historical silver bullet many claim it is? Or are there good reasons to be skeptical? By the end of this, you'll have the evidence you need to decide for yourself. Who was Tacitus? To get the weight of the evidence, you first have to understand the witness. Our star witness is Publius Cornelius Tacitus. If you made a greatest hits list of Roman historians, Tacitus would be right at the top. Born around 56 AD, just a couple of decades after the crucifixion of Jesus, he was a man of huge intellect and social standing. Tacitus wasn't some fringe commentator writing gossip from the back alleys of Rome. He was a Roman senator, a consul, and eventually the governor of a major province. He was an insider, a member of the political elite. He was friends with other big names like Pliny the Younger, another writer who also described the early Christians. His career gave him incredible access to the inner workings of the Roman Empire. Modern scholars believe that as a senator, Tacitus would have had access to the Acta Senatus, the official records of the Roman Senate. This was like having a top-level security clearance to the National Archives. He was known for his tough, sometimes cynical approach to history, and his works, like the Annals and the Histories, are considered essential for understanding the early Roman Empire. So, we have a credible, well-placed, and respected historian. But what makes his testimony so compelling is his attitude toward Christians. To put it bluntly, Tacitus was not a fan. In the very passage where he mentions Christ, he calls Christianity a destructive superstition and refers to Christians as a group hated for their abominations. His writing is dripping with aristocratic Roman contempt for this weird new movement he saw as foreign and dangerous. This is a really important point. His obvious hostility means he had zero motive to invent a historical founder for a group he hated. If anything, his bias would be to dismiss them and their founder as a myth. The fact that he doesn't, and instead records the execution of their founder as a historical event, makes his account incredibly powerful. He isn't trying to help the Christian cause, he's simply recording the facts as he understood them for his history of the Emperor Nero's reign. This mention of Christ doesn't just come out of nowhere. Tacitus writes about it during a dramatic and terrifying event, the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. In July of that year, a fire broke out near the Circus Maximus, Rome's huge chariot racing stadium. Fanned by the wind and feeding on the city's tightly packed wooden buildings, the fire became a monster. For 6 days, it raged, destroying huge parts of the city. Of Rome's 14 districts, 3 were completely leveled, 7 were left in smoking ruins, and only 4 escaped untouched. The city was in a state of panic and despair, and pretty soon, a nasty rumor started to spread that the Emperor Nero himself had started the fire. The story went that he wanted to clear land for his ridiculously extravagant new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. Whether it was true or not, and historians are still divided, Nero was in a political nightmare. The people were furious and wanted someone to blame. To save his own neck, Nero needed a scapegoat. He found the perfect one, a small, misunderstood, and widely disliked religious group called the Christians. They were pretty new in Rome, mostly made up of the lower classes and slaves, and the Romans saw their beliefs as strange and antisocial. They refused to worship the Roman gods, which was seen as both atheism and treason. Rumors flew that they engaged in wicked rituals. They were, in short, the perfect punching bag. It's in his description of Nero's vicious persecution of this group that Tacitus makes his famous reference to their founder. He's explaining to his Roman readers who these Christians were and where their name came from. This context is everything, because it shows Tacitus isn't writing about religion. He's recording a major event in Roman history and, like any good historian, providing the necessary backstory on the victims of Nero's political game. Now we get to the main event. The passage is from Book 15, Chapter 44 of Tacitus's final work, the Annals, written around 116 AD. Tacitus has just described Nero's failure to kill the rumors that he was behind the Great Fire. He then writes this: "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." He then goes on to describe in horrifying detail the tortures they endured. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Let's just pause and feel the weight of that first paragraph. This isn't a Christian writing about his savior. This is a cynical Roman historian documenting a political power play by a desperate emperor. And in doing so, he gives a short, non-biblical summary of Christianity's origins that lines up shockingly well with the core historical claims of the New Testament. This little passage is probably the most important Roman reference to Jesus that exists. Let's break down the key bits of information Tacitus gives us and see how they stack up against the biblical account. It's in these details that we find the real power of his testimony. First, Tacitus says, Christus, from whom the name had its origin. Right out of the gate, he confirms that the Christian movement had a historical founder. He uses the title Christus, which is the Latin version of the Greek Christos, meaning anointed one or Messiah. This is the exact title the Gospels give to Jesus. Tacitus is telling his Roman audience, hey, that name Christian isn't just random. It comes from a real person named Christ. This is a direct hit to the idea that Jesus was a complete myth made up by his followers. Second, he writes that Christus suffered the extreme penalty. The extreme penalty was the Roman phrase for crucifixion, a brutal execution saved for the worst criminals and non-Roman citizens. This is a direct, non-Christian confirmation of the central event of the gospel story, the execution of Jesus. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all lead to this moment. Tacitus, from his totally secular Roman viewpoint, confirms this core fact. Third, Tacitus pinpoints the timing. During the reign of Tiberius. Emperor Tiberius ruled from 14 AD to 37 AD. This fits the biblical timeline perfectly. Luke's Gospel, for instance, says that John the Baptist started his ministry in the 15th year of Tiberius's reign, with Jesus' ministry and death happening shortly after. Tacitus independently puts the execution of Christus in the exact same historical window. Fourth, he names the official who did it, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. This might be the most jaw-dropping detail. Tacitus doesn't just confirm the execution. He names the very man the Gospels point to, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. For a long time, Pilate was a name known almost entirely from the New Testament. Seeing his name in a mainstream Roman history, tied directly to the execution of Christus, is incredible corroboration. It places Jesus not just as a figure of faith, but as a person in Roman provincial history, whose death was an official government act carried out by a known Roman official. Finally, Tacitus notes the movement's origin and spread. A most mischievous superstition broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Here, Tacitus confirms the movement started in Judea, the exact place the Gospels set Jesus' ministry and death. He also notes that even though its founder was executed, checked, as he puts it, the movement didn't just fizzle out. Instead, it broke out afresh and spread so fast that within 30 years, there was a big enough Christian community in Rome itself for the emperor to use as a public scapegoat. This fits perfectly with the story in the book of Acts, which describes Christianity's explosive growth from Jerusalem across the Roman Empire. When you line up these 5 points, you get a powerful, independent summary of the Gospel's historical framework, all from a hostile witness. As strong as this passage is, it's not without its critics. Any good investigation has to look at the other side. Over the years, skeptics have really raised 3 main objections. The first objection is, wasn't Tacitus just repeating what Christians told him? This argument suggests Tacitus isn't independent evidence, but just him parroting Christian beliefs. That's pretty unlikely for a few reasons. Tacitus was a careful and critical historian who took pride in his sources. As we mentioned, he likely had access to official records. It's very probable that an official event, like a Roman governor executing the leader of a movement seen as a threat, would have had a report sent back to Rome. Also, look at his tone. It's full of contempt, not belief. He doesn't say, Christians claim their leader was executed by Pilate. He states it as a fact. His language, mischievous superstition, abominations, shows he's reporting from the Roman establishment's point of view, not just repeating Christian talking points. The second, more serious objection is, could a Christian scribe have added the passage later? This is the interpolation theory. The idea that a Christian monk, copying the manuscript centuries later, just slipped in the paragraph to create proof for Jesus. This is a fair question for ancient texts, but the overwhelming consensus, even among secular historians, is that this passage is authentically Tacitus. First, the writing style, the grammar, the word choice, that short, sharp phrasing, is classic Tacitus. A forger would need to be a master of Latin to copy his unique style so perfectly. Second, as we've said, the language is incredibly negative. It's hard to picture a Christian scribe inventing a passage that calls his own faith a destructive superstition and its practices shameful. Lastly, the paragraph fits perfectly in the text. If you take it out, Tacitus is suddenly talking about Nero persecuting Christians without ever telling his Roman readers who they are, which would be uncharacteristically sloppy for a historian like him. The third objection is, Tacitus wasn't an eyewitness. He was born 25 years after Jesus died. This is true, of course. But if we use that standard, we'd have to toss out most of what we know about ancient history. Almost all ancient historians wrote about events they didn't see themselves, relying on earlier sources, official records, and eyewitness accounts. Thucydides, the great historian of the Peloponnesian War, did it. No one seriously doubts Julius Caesar existed, even though our main accounts of his life were written after he died. The fact Tacitus was writing a few decades later is completely normal for history. What matters are the quality of his sources, and given his position, they were probably the best around. It's so important to be clear about what this text proves and what it doesn't. Tacitus validates the historical framework of the Gospels, not their theological claims. He doesn't say Jesus was the Son of God. He doesn't mention a virgin birth. He says nothing about Jesus' teachings, his miracles, or, critically, his resurrection. In fact, by calling Christianity a superstition that was checked by the crucifixion, he's basically dismissing the resurrection. From his point of view, the leader was killed, and that should have been the end of it. The fact that the movement broke out again was, to him, just a sign of how stubborn and irrational it was, not proof of a miracle. So, did Tacitus validate the Bible? If validate means proving it's the divinely inspired word of God, then no. That's a question of faith, not history. But if validate means providing strong, independent, non-Christian historical proof for the existence of Jesus, his execution under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, and the start of the Christian movement in Judea, then the answer is a resounding yes. While Tacitus gives us the most detailed Roman account, he isn't the only non-Christian writer to mention Jesus or his followers. He's part of a small but important group of outside voices. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing around 93 AD, mentions Jesus twice. In one famous but debated passage called the Testimonium Flavianum, he describes Jesus as a wise man and a doer of wonderful works, who was crucified under Pilate after being accused by Jewish leaders. While most scholars agree this passage has some later Christian edits, they also believe there's an authentic core written by Josephus that confirms Jesus existed and was executed. Josephus also mentions the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, a line that is almost universally seen as authentic. The Roman historian Suetonius, writing around 120 AD, mentions that Emperor Claudius kicked Jews out of Rome because of riots at the instigation of Chrestus. Most scholars think Chrestus is a misspelling of Christus, and that this refers to fighting between Jewish and Christian groups in Rome over Jesus. Suetonius also mentions Nero's persecution of Christians, calling them a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. And Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor and a friend of Tacitus, wrote to the Emperor Trajan around 112 AD, asking for advice on how to deal with Christians. In his letter, he says they would meet on a certain day and sing hymns to Christ as to a god. None of these men were believers. Like Tacitus, they were either neutral or hostile observers. But when you put them all together, they paint a consistent picture. By the early 2nd century, the existence of Jesus, his execution by Pilate, and the movement he started were known facts in the Roman world, recorded by both Jewish and Roman historians. So, let's go back to our original question. Did a Roman historian validate the Bible? Publius Cornelius Tacitus, one of Rome's most brilliant historians, set out to write a history of the Roman Empire. He wasn't trying to prove or disprove anyone's religion, but in the process of documenting Nero's cruelty, he accidentally provided one of the most important pieces of extra-biblical evidence for Jesus we have. His short account, written with clear disdain, confirms the basic historical claims of the New Testament, that a man named Christ, the founder of Christianity, was executed by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate in Judea during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, and that his movement, against all odds, spread all the way to Rome. This passage doesn't prove Jesus walked on water or rose from the dead. It isn't a document of faith, it's a document of history. It shows that Jesus of Nazareth wasn't a myth, but a real person who lived and died in a specific time and place, a man whose life made such an impact that it even got noticed by the Roman elite. While Tacitus certainly didn't intend to prove the Bible was true, his writings offer a powerful, non-Christian account that matches its key historical claims, bridging the gap between faith and the annals of history. If you found this historical detective work interesting, subscribe for more deep dives into the places where history, faith, and ancient texts meet. And let us know in the comments, how convincing do you find Tacitus's account? Does it change how you see the historical Jesus? Thanks for watching.